Before starting the story, please like and subscribe the channel. Okay, let's dive into the story. I never believed in coincidences, not in my line of work. Every lead, every tip, even the whispers carried on the wind had a purpose. So when Maria Alvarez, the beloved local singer, vanished without a trace, something in my gut told me this was no ordinary disappearance. I had covered stories about Maria before, her rise to fame, her passionate performances, the way her voice seemed to weave spells over the audience. She was more than just a singer. She was a symbol of our town, a beacon of light in a place often shrouded in shadows. That light had been snuffed out when she disappeared, and the entire town was left in darkness. I took on the story as any journalist would, but I quickly realized this wasn't just another missing persons case. The police had hit dead ends, and the community was drowning in fear. There were rumors, whispers of someone stalking her, of strange occurrences at her performances in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. I had a hunch that the truth was buried beneath layers of secrets. My investigation started with the people who knew her best, her manager, close friends, even her family. But each interview felt like running into a brick wall. Her manager, a slick-talking man named Victor, insisted there was nothing unusual in Maria's life. Yet he couldn't explain the eerie phone calls she had been receiving, nor could he account for the fact that she had recently changed all the locks in her home. Her friends were no more helpful, their faces clouded with worry, but their words guarded. They spoke of her with reverence, but also with a strange sense of distance, as if they had been keeping something from her or from me. The first real lead came from her sister, Sophia. She had received a message from Maria the night she disappeared. It was short, almost cryptic. "He's watching. I don't feel safe." Sophia hadn't known what to make of it at the time, but now with Maria missing, the words took on a sinister meaning. "Who did she mean by he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sophia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know. She never mentioned anyone specific, but she was scared. More scared than I'd ever seen her." As I pieced together the fragments of Maria's final days, a pattern began to emerge. A man had been seen lingering near her performances, always in the shadows, never drawing attention to himself. Maria had mentioned him in passing to a friend, describing him as unsettling, but never elaborating further. The trail led me to a bar where Maria used to perform before she hit the big time. The bartender there, a grizzled old man with a memory as sharp as his tongue, remembered Maria well. More importantly, he remembered the man, always sitting in the back, eyes glued to Maria, but never approaching her. "He gave me the creeps," the bartender admitted, "but he never caused trouble, so I didn't think much of it." The bartender's words lingered with me as I left the bar, the image of the shadowy figure etched into my mind. There was something undeniably sinister about the way he described the man, but I needed more than vague suspicions. I needed proof, something concrete to unravel the mystery of Maria's disappearance. I decided to dig deeper into Maria's last known activities. According to her calendar, she had been working on a new album, a project that she had been incredibly secretive about. Only a select few knew the details, and those who did were either unwilling or too afraid to talk. Then there was the matter of her phone. The police had combed through it, but their search had been fruitless. They missed something, though. Something small, almost insignificant. In her notes app, buried under grocery lists and song ideas, was a single word: deceiver. It struck me like a lightning bolt. Who was this deceiver? Was it the man who had been following her? A former lover? Someone in her inner circle? The questions swirled in my mind as I tried to connect the dots. I tracked down her producer, a man named Carlos, who had worked with Maria on every album since her first. He was an intense man, passionate about his work, and clearly distraught over Maria's disappearance. But there was something else in his eyes, something more than just grief. Fear. "Carlos," I started cautiously. "Maria's last project. What was it about?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting as if he were considering whether to trust me. "It was personal. More personal than anything she'd done before. She was digging deep, confronting demons." "Whose demons?" I pressed. He shook his head. "Hers. Someone else's." "I don't know. She didn't share everything with me this time, but she was different, more paranoid. She kept saying she had to be careful, that she couldn't trust everyone. Did she mention anyone specific? Anyone who might have been a threat? Carlos exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. There was one person, an old friend, I think. They had a falling out years ago. She wouldn't say much, just that he was dangerous. But that's all I know, I swear. The name Carlos gave me was Daniel Cruz. A quick search revealed that Daniel had once been a close friend of Maria's, but their relationship had soured over some professional dispute. The details were murky, but the fallout had been severe. Daniel had vanished from the public eye shortly after, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. I decided to pay a visit to Daniel's last known address, a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. The place was a wreck, overgrown weeds, peeling paint, and windows covered in dust and grime. It looked like no one had lived there for years, but when I knocked on the door, it creaked open. The inside was even worse, dark, damp, and reeking of decay. I stepped inside cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the thick gloom. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself were suffocating. But what really set my nerves on edge was the silence. It was too quiet, as if the entire world outside had ceased to exist. As I moved deeper into the house, I came across a room that seemed out of place. A small studio, equipped with soundproofing and recording equipment. But everything was old, outdated. The equipment looked like it hadn't been used in years. Then I saw the tapes, dozens of them, stacked haphazardly on a shelf. I grabbed one at random and popped it into the recorder. As it played, Maria's voice filled the room. But this wasn't her singing. This was different. It was a conversation, one-sided. She was talking to someone, but I couldn't hear the other person. Maria sounded agitated, frightened. I listened closely, straining to catch every word Maria spoke on the tape. Her voice trembled with fear, laced with a desperation that sent chills down my spine. "You can't do this. I won't let you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You promised you would leave me alone. Why are you doing this?" There was a long pause, and I imagined her waiting for a response, though none came through on the tape. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. It was pleading, almost defeated. "Please, just let me go. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt them." Them. My heart raced as I rewound the tape to listen again. Maria wasn't just worried about herself. There were others involved. But who were they? And who was she speaking to? I searched through more tapes, finding similar recordings, all of them filled with fragmented conversations that painted a picture of a woman tormented by an unseen force. Each tape was a window into Maria's fear, her slow descent into paranoia and despair. The last tape was the most unsettling. The audio was distorted, crackling with static, but Maria's voice was still recognizable. She was whispering, her words barely audible. "You're not real. You can't be real. I made you up." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, startling me. I nearly dropped the recorder, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound had come from somewhere deep within the house. I quickly turned off the tape, stuffing it into my bag as I made my way toward the noise. I followed the sound to a narrow staircase leading to the basement. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But I couldn't, not when I was so close to the truth. I descended the creaky stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was pitch black, my flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. The smell of damp earth and rot was overwhelming, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. As I reached the bottom, the beam of my flashlight landed on something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the basement was a small makeshift altar, surrounded by candles that had long since burned out. On the altar was a photograph of Maria, her eyes wide with terror. Scattered around the photograph were strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed something else, something far more horrifying. Tucked behind the altar was a door, its surface scratched and battered, as if someone had tried desperately to get out. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked. But it wasn't. It swung open with a loud creak, revealing a small, dark room beyond. The stench was unbearable, a mixture of decay and something fouler, something that made my stomach churn. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the room. What I saw next nearly made me drop to my knees. There, lying on the cold, damp floor, was the decomposing body of a woman. Her face was unrecognizable, her features twisted in a grotesque expression of fear. But I knew it was Maria. I had found her, but it was too late. Before I could process the horror in front of me, I heard a sound. A faint rustling, like someone, or something, was moving in the darkness behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but the beam revealed nothing. The silence was suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs. Suddenly I heard a voice, low, guttural, and full of malice. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice echoed through the basement, a sinister whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I whipped around, my flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the room. But the darkness was impenetrable, swallowing the light before it could reveal anything. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice repeated, closer now, almost right behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the icy grip of panic tightening around my chest. Whoever, or whatever, was down here with me, it wasn't human. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that basement and never look back. But something rooted me to the spot, a morbid curiosity or perhaps sheer terror. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the walls. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the light, its form barely discernible in the gloom. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound authoritative. The figure didn't respond, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stepped back, my foot catching on something soft. I glanced down and felt a jolt of horror, another body, partially hidden under a rotting tarp. It was smaller, frailer, and I realized with a sickening dread that it was likely one of the them Maria had mentioned in her tape. Who were they? Friends? Family? I couldn't tell. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. I could see more of it now, a tall, gaunt shape, its face obscured by shadow. The air around it seemed to warp, like heat rising off asphalt, distorting its outline in a way that made it impossible to focus on. "Why did you kill her?" I forced the words out, hoping to buy myself time, to distract this thing. "She was mine," the voice hissed, dripping with possessive malice. "She tried to run, to escape, but she belonged to me." The voice was no longer human, if it ever had been. It was something older, something darker, a force that had claimed Maria and those around her. I knew then that whatever I was facing, it wasn't just a person, it was something much worse, something ancient, something evil. "Who are you?" I asked again, but this time I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The figure moved closer, its features becoming clearer. What I saw was a face twisted in a rictus of rage and jealousy, eyes burning with an unnatural fire. It was Daniel, or at least it had been. But whatever humanity had once resided in him was long gone. Maria was the light, and I was the shadow. He, or it, whispered, the words curling around me like tendrils of smoke. She thought she could hide, that she could be free, but she was mine, and so are you. My blood turned to ice as I realized what it meant. This wasn't just about Maria. It was about control, about possession. The thing that had consumed Daniel had also claimed Maria, and now it was turning its gaze on me. I backed away, the walls of the small room closing in on me, my mind racing for a way out. I bolted for the door, my only thought to get out of that cursed basement, out of that house. The door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I slammed my fists against it, no matter how desperately I clawed at the wood, it remained shut, sealing me in that suffocating darkness. Behind me, the basement seemed to grow colder, the air thickening as the presence I had felt before drew closer. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, so close it felt like it was inside my head. "She couldn't, and neither will you." Panic surged through me, but I fought to stay focused. There had to be a way out, a crack in the door, a weak spot in the walls. Something. I fumbled for my phone, praying for a signal, but the screen only flickered before going black, drained of all power. It was as if the very air in the basement was swallowing every bit of life, every chance of escape. Suddenly, a wave of nausea washed over me. The oppressive darkness seemed to press in on all sides, a living entity with a will of its own. I could feel it worming its way into my thoughts, twisting my perceptions. The basement walls started to blur and bend, and I struggled to keep my sense of reality intact. Then, without warning, the voice changed, no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural growl. "You've seen too much. You belong to me now." It was Daniel, or whatever had once been Daniel, fully unleashed, no longer confined to the house. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles burning with the effort. I knew I couldn't outrun it, but I had to try. I raced toward the trees, the darkness chasing me, closing the distance with terrifying speed. But just as the black tendrils were about to overtake me, I felt something, or someone, grab my arm. I twisted around, prepared to fight, but it was Maria, or at least it looked like her. She was translucent, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her eyes were filled with a desperate intensity. "Run!" she cried, her voice echoing with urgency. "It's too strong. You can't fight it. Run, and don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted into the forest, the cold night air biting at my skin, the ground uneven beneath my feet. The sounds of pursuit, of that thing, were deafening, but I kept going, Maria's voice pushing me forward. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at me like skeletal hands, but I didn't stop. Days passed, but the events of that night haunted me, clawing at the edges of my sanity. I knew that if I kept silent, the darkness that claimed Maria would continue to fester, spreading its influence like a poison. So I did the only thing I could. I told the world. The truth behind Maria's tragic end was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. As I dug deeper into her life, piecing together the fragments left behind, I began to understand the twisted chain of events that led to her demise. It started years before her disappearance, with Daniel Cruz, once a close friend and confidant. He had been by Maria's side during her rise to fame, but something in him changed. His admiration for her turned dark, obsessive. When Maria began to pull away, distancing herself from Daniel as she realized the intensity of his obsession, he didn't take it well. Desperate to maintain control over Maria, Daniel sought out something ancient and dark, something that promised him power, influence, and the ability to bind Maria to him forever. He dabbled in rituals and invocations, delving into the occult with a recklessness that would ultimately seal both their fates. What Daniel unleashed was not something he could control. The entity he summoned was a malevolent force, drawn to Maria's light, her spirit. It fed on her fear, growing stronger as Daniel's obsession deepened. Maria sensed something was wrong, even before the incidents began. Strange occurrences at her performances, the unsettling feeling of being watched, and the inexplicable terror that gripped her at night. As the entity took hold, Daniel's behavior became more erratic. He began isolating Maria, cutting her off from friends and family under the guise of protecting her. The more he tried to dominate her, the more the entity thrived, warping Daniel's mind and corrupting his soul. Maria tried to escape, to break free from the darkness that had ensnared her, but it was too late. The entity had marked her, just as it had marked Daniel. It was no longer just Daniel's obsession, it was the entity's will. In her final days, Maria's life became a waking nightmare. She changed the locks on her doors. She confided in no one except for cryptic messages to her sister, and she knew that her time was running out. On the night of her disappearance, Maria confronted Daniel. She begged him to stop, to let her go, but Daniel was beyond reason. The entity had consumed him entirely, and in its twisted logic, the only way to possess Maria completely was to end her life. In that dark basement, Maria fought for her life, but Daniel, driven by the malevolent force, overpowered her. But even in death, the entity did not release her. It kept her spirit tethered to that cursed place, feeding off the fear and agony that had culminated in her final moments. Daniel, now fully overtaken, was no longer human. He had become a vessel for the darkness, a shadow of the man he once was, doomed to haunt the basement where Maria's life was snuffed out. Maria's body, left to decay in that horrific place, was a testament to the evil that had been unleashed, a warning of what happens when obsession and dark forces intertwine. And the tapes she left behind were the only clues to the terror she endured, her final cries for help echoing in the darkness long after her voice had been silenced. The house, now abandoned, stood as a grim monument to the tragedy. And though I had escaped, the darkness that claimed Maria was still out there, watching, waiting for its next victim.